The main value of the ancient Chinese was that they valued the gods' approval. Religion played a big part in the social classes, especially at the top of the pyramid. The fact that the king himself was chosen by God showed how much people relied on him to choose a good leader. Number 1. Kings and nobles. The king was in charge over everything in the civilization, even religion. Number 2. Craftsmen. Craftsmen were so important because they got to work with the bronze and jade that was such a part of Chinese culture. Number 3. Farmers. Farmers made up the largest class in the social hierarchy. They used simple tools to do all their farming. Number 4. Slaves. Slaves were the least honored among the people. They worked on the public works such as irrigation, tombs, and other architecture. Important people such as kings and nobles were buried in tombs made by slaves.
Art and architecture were relative in God's approval because only the people closest to the gods got jade carvings and bronze castings in their coffins. Jade placed in a coffin represented high prestige and honor. Jades were used as offerings of sacrifice to the gods. They were placed in the coffins of important people to be used in another life. Not only were Shang dynasty workers skilled jade carvers, but they were also very skilled bronze makers. They were the first to develop the art of bronze casting. They would use bronze to make vessels, chariots, and weapons that would later be used in war. Art and architecture were important in God's approval because it affected how people were treated in the afterlife and how many offerings they were given.
Unlike jade carving, the mandate of heaven is not determined by social class. The mandate of heaven showed the Chinese valued the gods' approval because their emperor was chosen by the gods. When it was time for a new emperor, that was also determined by the gods. The gods signaled the people when it was time for a new emperor by creating natural disasters like earthquakes, drought, famine, uprisings, and many others. You can be chosen by the gods to be emperor even if you are in the lowest class. This also shows the Chinese valued God's approval because now everyone, no matter what class, can have a chance to be emperor. The 4 main principles for the mandate of heaven were also created by the gods. 1. It grants the emperor the right to rule. 2. There is one heaven, so there's one emperor. 3. The emperor's behavior determines whether they can rule or not. And finally, not one dynasty has permanent right to rule. Any dynasty can rule. There could be a change at any time. The gods had the only say in who is going to be emperor and for how long. That shows that the Chinese valued the gods' approval.
The people of China needed the gods' approval to do things in their everyday lives. But first, some background info. The main god they worshipped was Shang Di. He was the link between the heaven and people. The heavenly beings were the gods of the wind, sun, clouds, and moon. One way that the gods influenced people's lives was burial. Because they believed in the afterlife, farmers and above in the social class hierarchy would get things for the afterlife. For instance, they would place food in a bronze vessel called a Fang Ding Zun. And often for nobles and priests and higher class men, they would put tools and weapons and such in their tombs. And often for the royals, they would get human and dog sacrifices when they died. Also, they believed that when a relative died, their spirit would go to Shang Di to receive instructions, and then come down to Earth to influence people's lives and carry out those instructions. This is an example of animism, which was the belief that spirits inhabit everything, all objects and all people, and influence their daily lives. A third example is that they had festivals twice a year, one in spring for healthy crops, and one in fall for a plentiful season. My final example is that they used oracle bones to answer questions. An oracle bone was a turtle shell or a cow shoulder that when they had a question, they heated it up, then brought it to a king for interpretation of the cracks. They then recorded the answer, the question, and the ruler's name on the bone. They believed that the gods caused the cracks and answered their question.